And he said, what are some things we can do to dial in do in the dial-in process to make our lineups different from the field? In the past, you mentioned removing all 2 and 3 stacks of the chalkiest team. Is there anything else like that we could do? Yeah, so this is a good point. I actually have been kind of chewing on this idea of making this into maybe a strategy session here in the future, still kind of figuring out exactly how this would work. But what Devin's referring to here is this idea that I think I originally ended up talking about with Max here, about a way that you can handle chalk and deal with chalk, especially on the hitting side, from a game theory standpoint, from looking at ceiling outcomes and what's likely to happen. And the fundamental idea here was, if you have chalk that you're expecting the field to gravitate towards heavily, and your research is leading you to thinking that you want to play that team, which definitely often happens. I think a team like that for tonight is Vegas believes the best hitting spot on the entire slate is for the White Sox, and so does SaberSim. SaberSim is actually over on the White Sox compared to Vegas, so there's a bit of an agreement there. I think even with an ownership fade slider a little bit higher, you're likely to get some White Sox bats because there's an agreement there that that's the best hitting spot on the night. So let me run a test build here and we'll talk a little bit. I just want to talk for a bit about this actual idea, and then we can talk about maybe ways to expand on this or some other opportunities here. But this is probably the one that most consistently actually makes it into my process. I'm going to just adjust to projections here real quick so we don't see our message, and we'll build. And I'm pretty sure we'll get some White Sox bats. We can use a different team as an example if we want here. But we'll let this build for a second and talk about this here a little bit. I did just want to do a little bit of kind of a summary or a reminder on the point that Devin's talking about in this question here for folks who haven't seen it, because I think this is a good one. And I think this is a really good one for situations like we have tonight, but situations that generally tend to come up a lot. And that's like, how do I deal with a team that's going to be really chalky and I want to play them? And I think it's important to note too that the effect of the ownership fade slider affects the way the lineup is constructed and also affects the way that the lineup ends up being sorted overall. So you can see, actually, it seems like given restrictions on ownership, that the White Sox are probably not our most common stack. It's actually Milwaukee, probably because that they're coming in at a little bit lower ownership, but we are still getting some White Sox bats. And it looks like pretty commonly paired with Milwaukee. That seems to be our favorite lower ownership stack at the moment, or maybe occasionally a lower owned pitcher, which I'm not so sure if Heaney's going to be lower owned, but we'll see about that. But you can kind of see, right, Cincinnati here. The effects of ownership fade are already going to make it so that you're not playing just a lineup of straight chalk. You're making some sacrifices here or there. But what can we do to add a little bit of additional value here? The way I like to think about this idea is that there's going to be a lot of lineups in your contests that play a lot of White Sox bats. There's going to be a lot of lineups in your contests that play 5 stacks of White Sox bats, and they're in a remarkably good hitting position. And when you play them in a lineup where they are 3 stacked, or we don't have any 2 stacks, but where they are 3 stacked, we have 2 of those lineups, right? The ceiling outcome or the ceiling condition for the 3 bats that you happen to get provide more opportunities for the other bats that are very popular that you do not have, right? So even if you get the ceiling outcome from Moncada, Jimenez, and Sheets, right, and they all have 3 hits apiece and they all do great, they've provided a great deal of additional opportunity in the form of correlation to the other batters in the order. And we're not taking advantage of that, but a lot of other people are. That's the fundamental thinking here, is that we're not maximizing on the ceiling outcome of this particular team. That is a team that a lot of people are otherwise going to stack heavily. And that's kind of the 2 sides of the coin here, right? Is that we're not taking full advantage of the correlation and it's a chalky team. So we are potentially putting ourselves in a position that even if we are right, that it stands to benefit a team that stacked the team more aggressively. That's the whole principle here. So what I like to do in very kind of simple terms is just remove some of these small stacks of these kinds of teams that are really chalky, that I think are going to be often maybe some of the biggest 5 stacks on a slate. I think that is a way to add a little bit of value and it looks like even here, it just we didn't even end up playing anymore. So we're still getting access to some White Sox stacks. Best hitting spot on the night, according to both Vegas and SaberSim. 25% of our lineups. But we're playing for a full-on ceiling outcome, and we're not going to allow ourselves in a situation where that team does have a positive hitting outcome and we end up losing an advantage on the field because of the opportunities that the hitters we stacked provided to the other hitters in the lineup. That's kind of in a nutshell. I think that's a really great point. In terms of like, what are some other things that we can do here? It's kind of a big question, right? There's a lot to talk about here. I think a few other things that maybe are a bit unique that we haven't often had a chance to talk about come into play when thinking about roster constructions in terms of salary, right? So all the players in the pool have a salary associated with them. We have a salary cap that requires us to make decisions, right? That's the game of DFS. And it lends itself to certain constructions that end up being popular that sometimes overweight the likelihood of that, the frequency with which a certain roster construction is played starts to become higher than the actual success of those two individual players being the optimal plays. And I think this is best looked at on the baseball side when looking at pitchers, because there's typically bigger bands of pitcher salaries than there are for hitters. I think it can be a little bit trickier with hitters. I think this is a really good strategy in other sports as well. I think basketball lends itself really well to this, football. But one very easy way to do this is to go back and run what we called our chalk build, right? This is another idea that came up in my original video with Max about finding the right stacks in baseball DFS. And the way we do that is we turn all the sliders off, or actually we can just do that by saying cash. And we set a stack rule, and we'll set a stack rule of like 5. And basically what we're trying to mimic here is we're trying to build lineups that if some random guy just went into typical optimizer and took their projections and said, oh, in baseball DFS, I build a 5 stack and build lineups and print, right? This is like, what's that typical optimizer going to do for the slate tonight if you just put a 5 stack rule in and pressed go? Obviously, we're using SaberSim's projections, which may have some discrepancies, some differences here, but we can get an idea of what different cash viable lineups are. And let's go ahead and see what it looks like. And let's open up our pool a little bit. Let's look at the full 200. And we can kind of get an idea of the different constructions, right? So it seems like actually what is going to be a very common pairing tonight is Wheeler and Bueller together, implying that cheap stacks are gettable, right? First of all, if we're spending $2,000 of our $5,000 salary at pitcher, it means cheap stacks are viable tonight. They are playable, first of all. But it seems like kind of secondarily to that, and I think Heaney and Fried are actually likely to be a little bit more chalky, especially Heaney, than we think tonight. So I actually think probably what is also going to be a very common construction is going to be pairing Wheeler or Bueller with Heaney and Fried, right? So we've identified some pitching constructions. So what does that leave out, right? What are the constructions that are unlikely to be played here? Well, one is a cheaper route at pitcher, right? Where you're playing cheaper pitchers paired together and probably in the interest of getting really expensive bats. The other one would be kind of the mid-range, right? Pitchers that are maybe in the 9K, 8K range paired together. Doesn't seem like it's going to be a very popular construction. And what's interesting about this here is that I think the important thing to note is that we're not so much looking from the stand of the individual upside of these certain players, and we can do that in a second here. We're trying to find lineup builds that are unique because of the places where salary is applied, right? So, for example, if the most common construction was paying 20K at pitcher, and you spent 15K at pitcher or 12K, that's probably a little too low. I don't think that's realistic. But let's say 15K at pitcher, and you went with 2 cheaper guys or something like that. And again, this is all slate dependent. I'm not saying that any of this stuff is necessarily viable on the slate tonight, but I'm kind of just providing an example. You are going to get salary access in your hitting stacks that the vast majority of lineups just literally cannot even get. your constructions themselves will be unique because of the way the salary works. So I think maybe the next step of what you would do here is to then apply this when you actually ran your research build. So let's do that now, since I have time here. We'll talk about what that might look like. So I'm going to drop the stacking rule down to 4. Real quick, Ronald asked, are you guys only using DraftKings as a reference point? It is a bit of a bad habit of mine because DraftKings is my preferred site. I end up typically doing most of my builds here and my examples and stuff on stream on DraftKings. Whenever somebody says FanDuel, I always am happy to flip over and do FanDuel, and I probably could get better at looking at FanDuel more. So maybe I'll try to work that in here. Right now we're on DraftKings. It's not always DraftKings. I just play a lot of DraftKings, so I end up using it as my reference point a lot. But good question, and I know I can probably improve a little bit there. I'm going to run this as, let's run the full 150. And let's go ahead and run our research build now. So if you're just tuning in or you're a little bit unfamiliar kind of with what's going on here. So what we're talking about is we first identified what we thought are going to be the popular constructions around pitcher salary by running a build at cash settings, setting a 5-stack rule, and just seeing what it spits out. And now what we're going to do is we're going to run what we call an upside build, where we turn ownership off, and we turn smart diversity all the way to 10. So we use single game simulations. And what we're trying to do is just get an idea of what is viable, what could potentially be optimal on a slate like this. And let's go ahead and look at this. And I'm going to run the whole 150. So it's going to build 1500. This is going to take a second, but I want to have a nice big pool to look at. And I'll talk about maybe how you can kind of apply this, because just because a certain pitcher salary construction is possible doesn't always mean that there's a lot of other ways to go in your builds, right? It could be that there's 4 pitchers and some random combination of any 2 of them, like on tonight's slate. I think Fried, Heaney, Buehler, Wheeler, right? I think combinations of any 2 of those guys are going to be pretty popular. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's always viable builds that don't include at least one. Or that there's a lot of viable builds, or that you can eliminate them and still have enough builds to work with outside of that. So now we can take this into our research build and kind of identify, are there other opportunities, right? Or are there opportunities to do something different with our salary at pitcher that is naturally going to force us into different kinds of constructions, right? So this will just take a second. Again, I want the full pool of 1500 here. To work with, because I want to make sure I have a lot of lineups. So, but this is a great question. I was excited to have a little bit of a chance to talk about this because I've been thinking about these concepts a little bit lately, where it's not so much, we're not really researching baseball right now, right? This isn't updating projections because we think that a guy's dealing with an injury, or because Vegas lines have moved, right? Or something like that. This is really like a very DFS-y theory kind of thing that is interesting to talk about, but is kind of is somewhat removed from the sport itself here, and really focused on kind of the limitations of the game itself that we're playing. So let's expand our pool up to, actually, you know what? Let's keep it at 500 because I want to have the opportunity to actually be able to edit my exposure. So I'm not going to fill to the full 1500. We're going to leave it at 500. And I think what is an interesting way to do this is to just kind of start looking at what sacrifices you make when you opt out of certain constructions. So we saw that Wheeler and Buehler are probably the 2 kind of most common pitchers that are going to be used. There's going to be a lot of lineups that use both. There's going to be a ton of lineups that use one or the other. I'm curious. I'm just like, let's test the builder out and see how viable it thinks it is to play neither. Right? So what sacrifices are we making? Our best lineup has dropped to 32, Saber score of 94. If we were playing a full pool of 150, we are a little bit outside the top third of total lineups, right? So we built 1,500 lineups based on optimals that are coming out in the slate tonight. And we're seeing that There's a lot of ways to go. There's a lot of ways to be. There's a lot of optimal looking lineups that don't include either of those two pitchers. And it might be that the win equity of that particular construction here is overweighted by the field, right? And we can look at what some of these lineups start to look like. So here's an interesting one where we play two value guys. Fried's going to be pretty chalky, but we play kind of a more value pitcher that's probably a little less chalky. And if you look at these salaries, like look what we're able to spend at hitting. We've got 5,800 Javier Baez in a win game. Are they playing in? I think they're playing in Wrigley, right? Win game in Wrigley. These are not just individual players that maybe the field is underweighting, and maybe they're even chalky. But it's combinations of players that are unlikely to get played because of the way we are playing. We're using a different construction overall. We're using a salary construction overall that it allows us to get combinations of bats that are difficult to come by. I'm looking to see if there's another one. Here's another one that's interesting. Like another thing that would be another way of looking at this, right? Is that we play the chalky construction, but we're subbing in a player that is probably just going to be extremely lowly owned because at his salary band, all of the exposure is going to go to Buehler and Wheeler. Here's another one. Look at these prices on these bats, right? We're playing $6,700 Patrick Corbin that the field, no matter what, and he's not in the best spot probably, right? His value is pretty low. He's projected for 11 points, but he shows up in optimal lineups. And we've got this lineup where who's going to be able to build this lineup playing the chalk construction? Nobody, right? These are chalky players. Contreras is chalky. Abreu is chalky. Whoops. Moncada's chalky. Tim Anderson's chalky. But who's going to be able to play all those guys together? No one, unless there's a certain sacrifice made at pitching salary that no one else is going to do. And that's kind of the point that I'm getting at here, is that this is beyond looking at the players' ranges of outcomes and odds of having a ceiling outcome or odds of showing up in the optimal lineup versus their ownership, which is kind of what we get at when we typically run this build. A lot of what we always kind of harp on as a way to do this is to set this as the full 1,500 and look at who's optimal, right? Compare that maybe to their ownership, right? Seeing if maybe the field is overweighting or underweighting a certain player, someone like Bumgarner, right? Shows up in 2 times as many optimal lineups as his projected ownership, or in team stacks, looking at this compared to Vegas odds or something like that, or ownership projections to see if there's a team like Colorado that's showing up much higher. That's the typical way we do this, but this is kind of an alternate way of thinking about it from a roster construction around your salary of, are there constructions, not teams or players or stacks, but are there constructions that the field is underweighting compared to their relative success? And we eliminated the 2 by far chalkiest pitchers on the slate that are likely to be either paired together often or used one or the other extremely often, and found that even just in the pool of the first 1,500 optimals, we don't even have to leave the top third of that. We're like, our best lineup is still in the top third of the top 1,500 optimals here by eliminating construction that's going to be overwhelmingly used. And this actually, now that I'm looking at it, is a slate that this conversation works really well for. This doesn't always work. I've actually tried to do this on a slate before where we had a similar deal. And we literally, we were literally it was almost impossible to remove both the 2 pitchers at the top. And it also doesn't have to be, the last thing I'll kind of note here is that it doesn't necessarily have to be that it's the 2 aces that you're eliminating, right? This is entirely slate dependent. So it just so happens that after we ran our chalk build that we discovered that this lineup construction is going to be fairly popular. But there are slates where 2 cheaper pitchers is the chalk construction, or studs and scrubs where you play an ace and some guy at like min price because he's in a perceived really good matchup or something like that. Or it's all about identifying what that construction is and look at ways to be different from it. And I think kind of the ways that we would be different tonight, or the way that we could potentially force being different, is by doing that. And also, I'm using this for the purpose of an example of where I completely faded Buehler and Wheeler in a test build just to see if that was viable. this does not necessarily mean that you need to take that level of an aggressive stand where you're going into your actual build you're running and you're just Xing out the two highest projected pitchers on the slate. Maybe it is, right? I think what the test build has shown us is that maybe that's actually viable, especially in a really top heavy contest or something like that. But that doesn't mean that's what you must do. Maybe you are setting an exposure limit on them. So maybe you're matching the field or something like that. Or I don't know. Maybe if you're only playing a couple lineups, one thing you could do is just make sure that you're not playing them both together. So even if you're playing up to 20 or something like that, right? It's very easy to let's just say this was our actual build and we were playing 20 lineups, right? This is a little bit of what's the word? Manual work. But maybe we're filtering by Wheeler and Bueller, and there's only 2 lineups, and we can eliminate those 2, and let's fill back up. And now do we have any? No. So that could be a way of doing it, right? And maybe that's, so now we're almost at this point, like maybe this is a way to be different enough. But this doesn't get you as different of roster constructions, having Wheeler in 100% of your lineups, because you're actually just going to end up playing really common constructions. So maybe it doesn't work as well unless you're willing to take a really aggressive stand. But I think that's probably like the most interesting other one that has kind of come into mind here as I've been hosting the show and talking through this stuff that we really haven't had a chance to really dive into yet. There's a couple other ideas that we've talked about here before. I think while I have the time, let me see. I don't see any other questions. There is one other in the queue that I will get to, but I'll keep talking about this since I have the time. If anyone has any questions, feel free to shout them out. I'll jump right over since I'm kind of going off on my own here a little bit. I think the last point or the last thing that maybe I haven't really talked about often here before is let's go back to our test build here and take a look at this. And some of this is stealing a little bit of thunder from what I'll talk about in my video tonight when I'm actually building these lineups for my contest, because this is one I definitely like to use. But let's go ahead and back and look here. When you are looking at your stands on a slate, your approaches overall, especially on contests that are top heavy, that are bigger, that we need extra leverage, we can find that, I think. Why is it saying that? It shouldn't be saying that. We can find that sometimes by kind of thinking about, okay, there we go. By thinking about what happens at the ceiling outcomes for certain players, right? So a good example of that is if you are going to be overweight on an unpopular player or underweight on a popular player, it may make sense to think about what the game outcomes look like when you are right about that, or when that player, I don't know why I keep saying this message, it's annoying me, has success. Sorry, I keep getting distracted here. And then build that into your exposures overall. And this really works well if you're playing like at least 20 lineups, but maybe even 150. I don't even know why is it even going to build more lineups here? I don't know why that message was showing up. We'll just let this catch its breath here for a second. It might be because I was messing with exposures and then re-expanded the pool. That's actually probably what it is, now that I think about it. I think I had an exposure in there and re-expanded the pool, and it was like, whoa, 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 don't do that. So we'll just give this a second to catch up. Oh, it's still going. I think it's only going to build another 150. I'll just let this finish because I don't want to see that message. I want to look at this, and we'll go from there. Okay, I'm just going to stop it. Hopefully, leave me alone. Okay, perfect. Okay, so one of them that popped off like immediately to me when I was just looking at this, mostly because I've already researched the slate a little bit here today, is the Heaney situation. overall, right? I think he's likely to be much chalkier than this. And I noticed it first because Colorado is popping as a stack when we look at our full pool. And when we look at something like the Vegas odds for the slate tonight, that is just not the same situation, right? So we've clearly got this situation here where Colorado is likely to be not very highly owned. I think Heaney's likely to be very owned. The field perceives that that's a good pitching matchup for Heaney or a bad hitting spot for Colorado, right? And we can go and check here and look back at Colorado, right? We are a run over their run total right now. There's kind of some general indications that we are overweight on Colorado. And maybe this is a situation that necessitates more research, right? Sometimes maybe the answer is to bring down this run total if you think that there's something that's being overlooked, but maybe we're happy with this and we want to roll with it, right? It may make more sense rather than playing both sides of this here in 150 lineups of having some exposure to Heaney and to Colorado to kind of play a side there, right? And play the situation where we're right. Like I keep hearing, I've been watching a lot of best ball content lately for NFL, and there's this interesting saying that's kind of been floating around where people are saying draft like you're right. And I think some of that's a little bit can be applied here too, especially again, single entry, 3 max, small field stuff. Maybe this doesn't fit. This is like for bigger contests where you really need to be very right to be profitable over the long term, right? There's this idea of, I think, kind of think like build your lineups like you're right. And this almost to me, if you can't tell already, I feel a little less confident about this idea overall than the one we were just talking about. But there's this idea to me that like this almost feels like a 10% hedge against a outlook that we have about the slate overall. If Heaney's actually going to be 30% owned, which I think he could be, and our model is a run total over on Vegas on the Rockies, and they are our 6th most popular stack of a team that has a Vegas total of 4.0 runs or something like that. Build your lineups like you're right, because you need to be so right to be profitable in the kind of contest I'm imagining this strategy being useful for. Even like something like the Minimax, 45,000 entrants, right? You need to be very right to win that. And if I only have 150 lineups to play with, maybe I'm not so interested in using 15 of them as a hedge against the other 15 of them that have Colorado bats, right? So the way I would maybe apply this is to just fully fade Heaney, because he's the chalky piece in this. You could kind of do a similar approach. Let's see if, let me see here. I want to find one that's not so black and white. I feel like hitter and pitcher like that are very, very black and white. But let me see if I can find one. I guess it is just going to be that way, but I want to find one that's maybe not so like in your face, because we're a run total over Colorado, and that may change or that may come down, but maybe one that's not so aggressive. And I think a good example is I saw that Tyler Mahle was showing up in a lot of optimals here as well. And I think that might be an interesting one. Because we're also, I think the thing that would be interesting with Mahle here, wow, we have 3,000. I don't really know why. Holy smokes. I don't know why this built so many lineups for us now. Maybe I'll start with a new build. That's crazy. Why are there 3,000 lineups? Anyway, hang on. Be patient with me here. I may need to just start with a new build because this is okay. So this was popping that was just like somewhat interesting to me, of like another guy that I think Chicago's going to be popular, right? 5.0 run total. I don't think Mahle's going to be very popular. We have him as the 6th most optimal pitcher of 1,500 lineups. And we like Chicago too. They're our 2nd most popular stack. But there's almost, I feel like between those two weights, right, of playing Chicago and being right with a lot of other people that are also playing Chicago versus playing Mahle, who has perceived optimal equity that I don't think will come in this high owned, to be completely honest. If Chicago comes in as high as I think they're going to be, maybe the better route here is to be overweight on Melee. And the reason why I think this is like a strategy, or like this is actually something that you could do, or a way you could add additional value, is because the top 20 lineups I don't think are actually going to really represent this. So you can see here, when we limit it down to actually just 20, we're just getting Chicago because they're the lineups that show up at the top. But we were just given a reason by the builder that maybe there's a case to be made for playing the other side of that, where we can find additional leverage on the field. So let me know if that is confusing, if anyone's just like totally lost on that one. It's I don't know. I think the idea there is like looking at a situation where maybe there's SaberSim is giving you an indication that there's optimal equity or win equity on both sides of the coin, of the pitcher and the stack. And if that's the case, it may sometimes make just sense to just pick the one that zig where the field's going to zag, right? Like the one that the field's not going to do. And we saw that, yeah, sure, Melee is the sixth best pitcher, and Chicago is the second best stack according to the lineups that we've built at these optimal settings. But that's not how they're being perceived, or actually that's not at all how they're being perceived. Melee's probably being perceived as like one of the worst pitchers, and the stack is being perceived as one of the better stacks. So anyway, that's kind of like the idea there. I think those are two, before I keep going on and using up my whole time I have here today, right? In summary, one is looking at roster construction by salary and knowing that if a certain amount of salary is committed to pitchers, certain amounts of salary cannot be committed to hitters because of the salary requirements. And we can use that as a tool to build unique constructions without even looking at the players necessarily, right? We know that we have constructions that are unique because of the way we applied our salary. And number two is that, especially in top heavy contests where you're playing a lot of entries, look at when there are optimal constructions that use kind of both sides of the coin of players that are negatively correlated with one another. Consider taking a player at maybe a slightly less chance of being optimal, or taking the side that has a slightly less chance of being optimal if you're expecting the field to way overly gravitate to the team that's perceived to being optimal, right? So we had two examples. Heaney and Colorado both have Colorado stacks have like equal optimal equity. They were both showing up in 10% of our big pool of 1,500 lineups, but the field's going to play Heaney. So consider Colorado. Same thing with Melee and the Cubs, right? Melee is our sixth most popular pitcher, or sixth most optimal pitcher, looking at the full pool. Here, I should just pull this back up. And Chicago is our second most popular stack when looking at the full pool. But the field's not going to play Melee. They're going to play Chicago. So consider Melee, right? So interesting ideas. I think those are kind of... that's kind of the way I thought about this question, right? Of like the dial-in process to make our lineups different than the field. And this isn't so much, this is like game theory kind of stuff. This isn't so much, you don't need to be digging into advanced stats or MLB stat sites or anything like that, right? This is like pure thinking about literally the game theory, like the components that make up the game in terms of salary requirements that we can take advantage of. So